There are people who are not born to be left alone. From the moment they learn to stand, the world begins teaching them where to bend, how to lower their eyes, how to soften their voice, how to accept a smaller place without complaint. Some are taught this lesson so early that they mistake it for fate. And yet, every so often, a person appears who quietly refuses that lesson. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with posture, with an inner decision that says, I will not live my life on my knees, even if kneeling would keep me safe. This is not the kind of person history celebrates easily. These people do not always win elections. They do not always lead nations, and often they are pushed aside, silenced, or locked away. Their names are spoken softly, if at all, but their presence lingers, like a memory a community refuses to let die. This story begins before fame, before movements, before prisons and laws written to erase a man. It begins in the quiet space where a human being realizes that dignity is not something granted by permission. It is something claimed, even when claiming it comes at a terrible cost. Imagine a world where every rule reminds you that you do not belong, where a piece of paper decides whether you may walk freely on the land of your birth, where your future is discussed without your voice in the room. In such a world, survival often depends on silence. But what happens when someone decides that silence is more dangerous than punishment? What happens when a man chooses truth over comfort and integrity over acceptance? This is not just a South African story. It is a story that echoes in church basements, in factory break rooms, in southern kitchens and northern streets. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told to wait, to be patient, to accept less for the sake of peace. Before the world labeled him a threat, before the state decided he was too dangerous to walk among others, he was simply a man who believed one thing with unshakable clarity, that African people did not need permission to be human. Tonight, we remember a life shaped not by compromise, but by conviction. A life that teaches us this quiet truth. Systems fear nothing more than a person who has already chosen how they will stand. This is the story of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. Robert Sobukwe entered the world in a place where expectations were already written for him. Graf Reinet was not loud with violence. It did not need to be. Its power lay in routine, in knowing who was meant to sweep the streets and who was meant to walk past without looking. Sobukwe was born into a working family where survival depended on effort, discipline, and silence. His father labored for the municipality. His mother worked long hours as a domestic worker and cook. Nothing about their lives suggested rebellion. Everything suggested endurance. In that home, young Robert learned responsibility early. He watched adults rise before sunrise, return exhausted, and repeat the cycle without complaint. This was not weakness. It was dignity under pressure. And it planted a quiet understanding inside him that African people carried strength long before anyone called it resistance. But he also learned something more dangerous. He learned that this strength was expected to remain unseen. At school, he showed unusual ability. Teachers noticed. Opportunities appeared, small but rare. Yet, even as doors opened, invisible lines remained firmly in place. Education was allowed, but ambition was monitored. Excellence was permitted, but only so far as it did not question the order of things. Sobukwe began to sense the contradiction. If African people were capable of learning, leading, and thinking deeply, then why were they treated as temporary guests in their own country? Why did intelligence require obedience as its price? This question did not yet make him a political man. It made him an observant one. He did not grow up angry. He grew up attentive. He noticed how rules were enforced differently, how respect was conditional, how silence was praised as maturity. These lessons were not taught directly, but they were everywhere. Most people learn to survive such a world by adjusting their posture, by bending just enough to avoid trouble. Sobukwe learned something else. He learned that bending, repeated over a lifetime, reshapes the spine, and quietly, long before he had language for it, he made an inner promise. He would not pretend that limitation was natural. He would not confuse patience with surrender. This was not yet defiance. It was preparation. Before speeches, before movements, before prison cells and isolation. There was a boy who understood that dignity does not arrive suddenly. It is built, slowly, from the refusal to accept a smaller self than the one you know you are. When Robert Sobukwe arrived at Fort Hare, he did not come as a rebel. He came as a young man who believed, like many others, that education was the narrow bridge out of limitation. Fort Hare was supposed to be that bridge. It was the place where African intelligence was acknowledged, trained, and carefully contained. It produced thinkers, teachers, and administrators who would be useful to the system without ever threatening it. At first, Sobukwe played his part well. He studied literature and language. He listened closely. He excelled. Professors praised his discipline and clarity of thought on the surface. This was success. But beneath it, something unsettled him. One subject in particular changed the way he saw everything else. Native administration. On paper, it was a field of study. In practice, it was a manual for managing African lives without African consent. It explained how authority could be exercised over a people while pretending it was for their benefit. Sobukwe did not read these lessons passively. He read them against his own experience, against his parents' labor, against the quiet rules he had grown up obeying. And suddenly, education stopped feeling neutral. He realized that knowledge could be used in two very different ways. It could train a person to fit neatly into an unjust structure, or it could expose the structure itself. That realization changed him. He began asking questions that made others uncomfortable. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with precision. He asked why African leadership had to be supervised, why participation required permission, why intelligence was welcomed only when it did not lead to independence. Around him, many chose caution. Fort Hare had taught them how fragile opportunity could be. One wrong word could close doors forever. Silence, they believed, was the price of progress. Sobukwe saw the cost differently. If education required silence, then it was not liberation, it was training. And he refused to confuse the two. This was the moment his path narrowed. He was no longer simply preparing for a career. He was preparing himself to speak. Even if speaking meant losing everything that education was supposed to secure. From this point on, learning was no longer about advancement. It became about responsibility. And responsibility, once accepted, does not loosen its grip. As Sobukwe's understanding deepened, something else began to form alongside it. A voice. Not a loud one at first, not the kind that demands attention by force. His voice grew out of clarity, out of sentences shaped carefully, with no wasted words. When he spoke, people leaned in, not because he was dramatic, but because he was precise. He did not inflame emotion. He ordered thought. At Fort Hare, this difference became visible. Other students debated to impress. Sobukwe spoke to define. He did not chase applause. He chased truth. And in doing so, he began to stand apart. He was elected to positions of leadership not because he campaigned for them, but because others recognized something solid in him. When he spoke, confusion settled. When he argued, it was difficult to dismiss him without confronting the weakness of your own position. This was not charisma in the usual sense. It was authority rooted in conviction. Sobukwe believed that words mattered because they shaped how people understood themselves. He refused slogans. He refused borrowed language. He insisted on speaking from the center of African experience, not from frameworks designed elsewhere. This insistence made him respected, but it also made him dangerous. Those who listened closely realized that Sobukwe was not merely criticizing policies. He was challenging assumptions. He was asking African students to see themselves not as participants waiting for approval, but as a people with an inherent right to define their own future. That shift was subtle, but profound. Leadership, for Sobukwe, did not mean commanding others. It meant clarifying choices. It meant forcing a moral question into the open and refusing to let it be avoided. This was why his presence unsettled both allies and opponents. He did not offer easy comfort. He offered responsibility. As his reputation grew, so did the tension around him. Some admired his courage. Others worried that he was moving too fast, saying too much, risking everything that previous generations had carefully preserved. Opportunity, they warned, could be lost. Sobukwe understood the warning. He simply rejected the fear behind it. To him, a future built on silence was not a future worth inheriting. If education produced leaders who were afraid to speak honestly, then it had failed its most basic purpose. By the time he left Fort Hare, Sobukwe was no longer just a student with ideas. He had become a man whose words carried weight, a man who knew that once you teach people to see themselves clearly, you cannot ask them to unsee. And from that point forward, his voice would no longer belong only to him. It would belong to the consequences it created. By the time Sobukwe stepped fully into political life, the path ahead had already narrowed. He joined the African National Congress Youth League, believing, at first, that it could become a vehicle for true African self-determination. He worked, he organized, he spoke with discipline and purpose. But over time, a quiet fracture opened between what he believed and what he saw. The organization he served was growing broader, more cautious, more willing to negotiate its language in order to remain acceptable. Advisory boards were tolerated, compromises were explained as strategy. Participation in structures designed by the system was framed as progress. Sobukwe could not accept this. To him, there was a difference between patience and permission, between strategy and surrender. He believed that African people did not need to be invited into freedom. They needed to claim it, and any movement that forgot this truth, no matter how respected, risked becoming part of the problem it claimed to fight. This belief placed him in an impossible position. To stay meant safety. It meant numbers. It meant protection within the crowd. To leave meant isolation. It meant being labeled divisive, extreme, unrealistic. It meant standing alone against both the state and former comrades. Sobukwe did not dramatize this choice. He did not announce it with bitterness. He simply followed his conscience to its conclusion. He argued that African liberation could not be outsourced, that dignity could not be negotiated through intermediaries, that a people who did not believe in their own capacity to lead themselves would never truly be free, no matter how many concessions were granted. Many heard his words and grew uncomfortable. Some dismissed him as rigid. Others warned that history rewarded flexibility, not principle. They spoke of timing, of balance, of working within reality. Sobukwe listened, and then he chose. He chose integrity over belonging, clarity over consensus, a harder road over a safer lie. Leaving the African National Congress was not an act of ego. It was an act of alignment, a refusal to live divided between what he said in private and what he defended in public. From that moment forward, Sobukwe accepted the full cost of independence. He would no longer be protected by numbers or reputation. He would be judged entirely on the strength of his convictions. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because for Sobukwe, freedom that required silence was not freedom at all. It was simply a more comfortable cage. Founding the Pan-Africanist Congress was not a moment of triumph for Robert Sobukwe. It was a moment of exposure. Without the shelter of a large organization, everything became sharper. Every word mattered. Every action carried weight. There were no longer layers to absorb risk. Whatever happened next would land directly on him. Sobukwe accepted this fully. The Pan-Africanist Congress was built on a simple but uncompromising belief that African people were the rightful owners of their land, their labor, and their future. Not as a slogan, as a moral position. Sobukwe insisted that liberation could not depend on approval from those who benefited from domination. Freedom, he believed, was not a gift to be negotiated. It was a condition to be restored. This clarity attracted people quickly: workers, students, ordinary men, and women who were tired of being spoken for. Sobukwe did not promise easy victories. He did not promise safety. He promised honesty, and for many, that was enough. But clarity also brings danger. The state watched closely. Former allies criticized openly. Newspapers framed him as radical, inflexible, unrealistic. Behind these labels was a deeper fear. Sobukwe could not be easily managed. He did not adjust his language to remain acceptable. He did not soften his message to gain allies. He spoke as though African dignity was non-negotiable. Because to him, it was. Leadership weighed heavily on him. He understood that every decision would affect others, not just himself. This made him careful, but never timid. When action was required, he did not hesitate. When restraint was necessary, he enforced it with discipline. What distinguished Sobukwe was not aggression, but resolve. He believed that a movement without moral clarity would eventually collapse into compromise. And compromise, once normalized, would teach the next generation to expect less. This, more than repression, was what he feared most. So he chose a narrow road, one that offered no guarantees, one that demanded sacrifice long before it promised results. In building the Pan-Africanist Congress, Sobukwe was not trying to make history. He was trying to prevent erasure, to ensure that African people could look at themselves without apology. The cost of this choice was already visible. Surveillance increased. Pressure mounted. Friends urged caution. But Sobukwe had already crossed the line that makes retreat impossible. Once you lead people toward dignity, you cannot ask them to return quietly to humiliation. And once you accept that responsibility, there is no safe way forward. Only an honest one. The morning of the protest arrived without spectacle. Robert Sobukwe had already decided what he would do. There was no last-minute debate, no dramatic hesitation. He had written to the Commissioner of Police in advance, informing him that the Pan-Africanist Congress would begin a peaceful, disciplined protest against the past laws. This was not provocation. It was declaration. Sobukwe believed that moral action should never hide. He resigned from his teaching post that same day. He arranged for his family's safety, not because he expected chaos, but because he understood consequence. Then, he walked toward the police station, not as a criminal, but as a free man, choosing arrest over submission. At Sharpeville, thousands gathered. Men and women arrived without weapons, without passes, without fear, carefully concealed behind routine. They came to offer their bodies as proof that a law without legitimacy could not command obedience forever. Sobukwe did not command the crowd like a general. He did not inflame them with rage. His presence communicated something steadier: discipline, resolve, the understanding that dignity does not need noise to be real. What followed exposed the truth. The system could no longer hide. Gunfire tore through the gathering. People fell. Panic replaced expectation. In that moment, history fractured, not because protesters turned violent, but because the state revealed what it was willing to do to preserve control. Sobukwe was arrested, just as he had intended, but he could not control what the world would witness next. Sharpeville became a mirror held up to the regime. It showed the cost of laws enforced without consent. It showed how fear reacts when authority is challenged by unarmed conviction. For Sobukwe, this day marked the end of any remaining illusion. He knew the price of standing openly had now been paid in blood, and still, he did not retreat. He did. Sharpeville was not a strategy gone wrong. It was a moral line crossed by the state, not by those who gathered. Sobukwe would carry that knowledge into prison, into isolation, into the long silence that followed. He had chosen the point of no return, and history had answered, not with justice, but with exposure. Prison was meant to end Robert Sobukwe's influence. Instead, it revealed how deeply the state feared him. After his conviction, Sobukwe was sent to Robben Island, but not as one prisoner among many. He was isolated, separated, kept apart, not because he was violent, but because conversation itself was considered dangerous in his presence. The authorities understood something clearly. Sobukwe did not need an audience to lead. His ideas traveled quietly, from mind to mind, so they removed the audience, alone in his cell. Sobukwe entered a different kind of struggle. There were no rallies to organize, no speeches to deliver, no movement to direct. There was only time, silence, and the constant pressure to disappear inward. Many would have broken. Sobukwe chose discipline. He read, he studied, he trained his mind with the same rigor he once demanded of public action. Where the state intended stagnation, he practiced growth. Where it demanded invisibility, he preserved clarity. This was not withdrawal. It was resistance refined. The law that kept him imprisoned beyond his sentence was designed specifically for him. Not because he was powerless, but because he was not. Even in isolation, he remained a reference point, a standard, a reminder that dignity could survive confinement. Years passed. The world outside shifted. Names rose and fell. But Sobukwe remained exactly where he had chosen to stand, unavailable to compromise, untouched by bitterness. He did not plead for release. He did not trade silence for comfort. He accepted captivity without allowing it to define him. This quiet refusal unsettled his captors more than any protest ever could. Solitary confinement was supposed to erase him. Instead, it distilled him. When Sobukwe finally left Robben Island, he carried no illusions. He knew freedom would not come easily, if at all. But he also knew something more important. They had failed to take what they wanted most. They had not taken his mind, and as long as that remained intact, the struggle had not ended. It had only changed its form. Freedom, when it finally came, arrived without celebration. Robert Sobukwe was released from prison, but he was not released from control. The state did not need walls anymore. Surveillance replaced bars. Restriction replaced chains. He was sent to live in Kimberley, far from political centers, far from the communities that once gathered around his voice. Every movement was watched, every visit noted, every word weighed. This was freedom emptied of its shape. Sobukwe was forbidden from speaking publicly, forbidden from organizing, forbidden from returning to the life he had once known. The system hoped that time, isolation, and irrelevance would succeed where prison had failed. Once again, they misunderstood him. Sobukwe did not attempt to reclaim the past. He did not protest his silence. He adapted without surrendering. He turned to law, not as ambition, but as service. Quietly, deliberately, he studied, and when he was finally allowed to practice, he opened a small legal office to assist those crushed daily by the same machinery that had crushed him. This was not retreat. It was continuity. Even under constant monitoring, Sobukwe refused bitterness. He did not teach resentment. He taught steadiness. Those who met him during these years described a man who spoke softly, listened carefully, and carried no illusion that justice would come quickly. But they also described a man whose presence still commanded respect. Then illness arrived. Lung cancer took hold while permissions were delayed. Treatment was postponed. Travel approvals stalled. Even as his body weakened, the system maintained its grip, as though fearing that compassion itself might restore his influence. Sobukwe faced this final injustice without spectacle. He did not beg. He did not curse history. He endured as he had always lived without compromising the man he had chosen to be. In his final years, stripped of platform and power, Robert Sobukwe demonstrated a truth many never learn. That resistance is not always loud. That dignity does not require an audience. That a life lived consistently can speak even in enforced silence. When he died, there were no state honors, no official acknowledgement. But something more durable remained. A memory of a man who had never asked permission to stand upright. Some lives are remembered because they ended in victory. Others are remembered because they refused to bend. Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe belongs to the second kind. He did not live long enough to see the system that caged him fall apart. He did not return to public office. He did not reclaim the spotlight. And yet, his absence itself became a question history could not comfortably answer. Why would a government fear a man it had silenced? The answer is simple and unsettling. Sobukwe represented something no prison could contain a standard. He lived in a way that exposed the difference between power and legitimacy, between authority and moral right. He reminded people that freedom begins long before laws change. It begins the moment a person decides who they will not become. For many, his name faded from textbooks and official ceremonies. But among those who understood the cost of standing upright, Sobukwe never disappeared. He lived on in quiet conversations, in memories passed from elders to children, in the unspoken knowledge that compromise is not always wisdom. Sobukwe's life teaches us that history is not only shaped by those who win, it is shaped by those who refuse to surrender their inner ground. That lesson belongs not only to South Africa, but to the broader story of African history and Black history across the world. For those who listen closely, his story carries a particular resonance. It speaks to anyone who has ever chosen dignity over approval. Anyone who has paid a personal price for telling the truth. Anyone who understands that some forms of resistance are meant not to succeed immediately, but to endure. This is why his life fits among the great history legends. Not because of conquest, but because of consistency. It also explains why his story is often shared quietly, almost like history for sleep. Not to excite the crowd, but to steady the spirit. Sobukwe did not leave behind a blueprint for power. He left behind a posture. And posture, once learned, cannot be unlearned. If there is one thing to remember, it is this: systems can rewrite events, delay justice, and bury names, but they cannot erase the example of a human being who chose to stand fully, knowingly, and without regret. Those examples become historical facts of a different kind. They live not on paper, but in the way people carry themselves forward. And as long as someone, somewhere, remembers that freedom begins with refusing to kneel, Robert Sobukwe is not gone. He is still standing.